Hey, it's your pal Mike Shea from the website Sly Flourish and author of the books The Lazy Dungeon Master and Sly Flourish's Fantastic Locations. I'm going to be hosting a brand new show on the Don't Split the Podcast network called the DM's Deep Dive. Each month, I'll be talking to a member of the D&D community about a particular topic of the game like encounter design, tools for improvisation, and game pacing. You can subscribe to the show through iTunes, on Twitch, or on YouTube. Join me, and we'll all work together to make our games fantastic.
This is Tabletop Babble. I'm James Introcaso. This week on the show, I'm talking with amazing game designers Wolfgang Baur, Steve Winter, and Dan Dillon about world building in RPGs and designing new spells. Wolfgang is the founder of Kobold Press, a great third-party company that is preparing to kickstart 2 books to bring their immersive, enormous campaign setting of Midgard into 5th edition D&D. Steve and Dan have worked closely with Wolfgang to bring his world to life, and they have a ton of credits to their name. Let's jump right into the good stuff. Here's my chat with them.
All right, everybody, now I am here with 3 amazing titans in the industry. I'm talking to Wolfgang Baur, Steve Winter, and Dan Dillon. Gentlemen, welcome to Tabletop Babble. It's great to have you guys. How are you doing?
Good to be here.
Yeah, thanks.
I'm excited to be here. Thanks for having us on, James.
Excited to have you here. We could probably spend this entire episode listing all of your credits. Dan is one of the 4 horsemen. Steve and Wolfgang have both worked at Wizards of the Coast, and now Wolfgang is the Kobold-in-Chief at Kobold Press, and Steve does a lot of work over there at Kobold. You may have heard of Hoard of the Dragon Queen or Rise of Tiamat. Those are their adventures, as well as the Tome of Beasts, which all 3 of these gentlemen worked on. So it is great to have you guys here because we are going to be talking about world building and making spells and an upcoming Kickstarter that you guys have that relates to that. So why don't we actually kick things off with that? Wolfgang, what is the Kickstarter that is coming down the road?
Sure. It's called the Midgard Campaign Setting, Dark Roads and Deep Magic. It's the revised edition of the Midgard setting we published 5 years ago. We published it then for Pathfinder, and these days a lot of people have been asking, so when's it coming out for 5th edition? And the answer is, well, this year, because there's only so many official campaign settings out there, and we have been putting out adventures and deep magic supplements and new racial variants, and a lot of them have links. Actually, the Tome of Beasts had a bunch of sidebars about Midgard, so people are asking, what is this, and can we get a conversion? So that's where we're going with it. We hope to kick it off here in January, very, very shortly, and we'll see how far it runs, right? I have high hopes, but it's my baby, so I'm a huge optimist about all the goodies we're going to jam into this. But we're going to do it in 2 books. We're going to do a setting book and a player book. It's going to be kind of cool.
That's awesome. That's amazing. And I know we've sort of been talking about this since the launch of 5th edition. When is there going to be Midgard? When's that coming around for 5th edition? So it is great to hear that it is finally underway. And I like that you almost set the groundwork for it in some other 5th edition Kobold Press products, which is awesome to see. Steve and Dan, what are your roles in these massive undertakings?
So I have had the privilege of designing quite a few things, both new design and conversions from Pathfinder Midgard material. So I've done several of the hero books that were mentioned before, the racial variants, the Midgard heroes, unlikely heroes. I also got to do a good bit of monster work on the Tome of Beasts, and there are some pretty big Midgard heavy hitters that show up in there, like the Queen of Night and Magic and all of her ilk.
Oh yeah, I used her in my own home campaign. She's deadly. Thank you.
Oh, awesome. She is absolutely supposed to be deadly. Yeah, if you're fighting her on her terms, buckle up. So I'm actually kind of a newcomer to the Midgard setting. Only in the last couple of years did it really even come up on my radar through my work with the Four Horsemen. I got introduced to some of the Midgard stuff. And it was for the Advanced Races Compendium. I did the Trollkin chapter, and I was hooked from then. I just I started reading on the material, figuring out what the heck Trollkin are, and that's it. And I've never looked back. And so I'm super excited that I've gotten to work on this through races, through a bunch of classes that I've designed that are going to be in the Midgard book, through some of the Deep Magic chapters that I've had the privilege to work on. I'm looking forward to this.
That sounds great. And Steve, what about you? I'm sure you have quite a bit of work to do on this.
Yeah, lots and lots of work. It's primarily I've been working on the developmental end of it, running all the numbers, making sure that things add up the way they're supposed to, and a fair amount of the editing. A lot of this material has existed in one form or another. As Wolf said, like all the Deep Magic chapters, a lot of that's being incorporated. So I've been kind of the spider at the middle of some of that web, trying to take a whole lot of pieces and assemble them into a coherent whole that actually makes sense, and making it something more than just a collection of disconnected pieces, right? We want these books to hang together and be very functional and useful as a whole.
It makes sense that they're going hand in hand. We've got the setting book, we've got a player book. And honestly, I don't know that we've seen an official 5th edition product set like that yet, right? It feels like we keep coming out with adventures that define realms and stuff, and we got the Sword Coast Adventurer's Guide. But to have something like this, a whole world in your hands, you've got everything, that is great and unique for this rule set. I want to talk a little bit about world building in general with you guys. And my big question, because I feel like this is where a lot of people get tripped up, is what is the first step? You sit down, you decide you want to make your world. What is the first step? And how was that exemplified in Midgard?
All right. Well, we talk about this a little in the Kobold Guide to World Building, but I can sum up that entire volume.
Sure.
I mean, for a lot of people, and for me, the first time I went out to do world building, the first thing you look at is a map, because it's concrete and it helps you sort of place nations and peoples and features, right? It's like a catalyst for your daydreaming and your design. And you may wind up redrawing that world map often, over and over. I find the more world building I do, the less I go to the map first. And I don't know if others' process is the same, but like the map is now really useful and goes hand in hand with the world building work. But for me, at least, the first step is figuring out what makes this world worthwhile and why does anyone care to adventure there, right? What are the big bets? What are the big options? So if we were talking about Middle-earth, we'd say, oh, well, there's a quiet pastoral race of halflings, hobbits, and there's a Dark Lord, and there's a bunch of humans, and they're in conflict. If we're talking about Midgard, we might say, well, there's the world of men, and there's elves and dwarves, sure, but there's also an opposite world, an outer darkness, a void surrounding this world, and a shadow realm that sits just the other side of it. Both of those are themes that have been in Midgard since the early days, but have gotten more pronounced over time. And this is what I see in world building all the time. It's like, initially, you don't know what's cool about it, right? You're like, I'm excited to build a world. And you just throw stuff at it. And this is why I think play and repetitive design is so important. You try things. And the things that players respond to are the things that you spend more time on. You don't get that from a map. You get that from your players. So for role-playing design, you've got this wonderful audience of people who are throwing ideas at you for what they want their characters to do. And then you add that to the map, right?
Right.
The paladin wants to be a member of an Amazon order. Oh, well, I guess I better put some Amazon in here somewhere, right?
Exactly.
And the more that continues, you say, oh, well, a bunch of people think this is cool. I guess that kingdom's getting bigger.
And so when you're designing your map in that first step, then do you do the whole thing, I guess, like end to end? Or do you say, here's a chunk of the world, and then if I need, an Amazon jungle area, we'll just expand the map a little bit and add that in?
Yeah, I mean, Midgard's a weird case because parts of it have been in my home campaign since like the late 80s. But most of it dates back to 2006 when I said, I need a city to base all of my Kobold press around. Okay, we'll call it Zobek. It's got a little Kobold ghetto. It's a river town. It's a trade town. Here's a city map. Done, right? I'm done with my world building. I've created a... yeah. And that's exactly how it always goes, right? I make one little barony over here and, put a vampire in charge. I'm sure that'll be all we need. And inevitably, no matter how small you start, people will ask, what's over the hill? What's over the mountain? What's up the river? And so it grows organically that way. I mean, you can draw the whole world map at the start if you want, but my experience is you don't have to.
I think that makes sense, and I see that piece of advice a lot, right? Like, leave it open, because why create an entire world at the beginning when you might want to change what's over those hills, right?
Well, I mean, there is one reason to create an entire world, right? It's the satisfaction of world building. I mean, I've been giving this advice more and more over time. People think of world building as a means to getting their campaign running as the homebrew they've always wanted. But I think world building is actually a perfectly fun hobby all by itself.
Sure.
Right? It's like you can do world building and not have players come along and mess it all up. You can build a perfectly awesome fantasy setting and draw the whole world map and tell stories in it and maybe write short stories about it or just put it in a binder and daydream, right? And it could turn into a playable space. I don't know. I think there's satisfaction just in the creation of the world itself.
Dan and Steve, what about you guys? What do you think is the first step for world building?
Well, Wolf kind of touched on this a little bit. To me, the first step is, and I'm assuming a world building here for running an RPG campaign as opposed to writing fiction, although I suppose it could work both ways. But to me, the most important question is, what kind of adventures do I want to run characters through in this world? If my goal here is to have a big save the world campaign, that's going to require one kind of approach. If my goal is to just have characters who are going to, bop around from town to town and dungeon to dungeon, having, very picaresque Conan the Barbarian type adventures, that's a completely different sort of setup. I think it's very easy to fall into the trap of wanting to make a world that will accommodate everything. I think you wind up with something very generic and kind of flavorless if you take that approach, and that you're much better off to decide what you want your focus to be and then put your energy into that as opposed to trying to accommodate everything.
That's a big trap you can fall into, is making your world kind of like a stew pot, where you travel a little ways and you're in essentially a completely different setting because you also wanted to have this thing in your world. The first thing for me, to echo what Steve said, is very much what kind of game do I want to be running? And that's going to be the general focus of the world. So I'm a huge fan of very flavorful settings like Al-Qadim. That's probably my favorite. So when I think of that, it's like I want to run Arabian Nights type stories. So that's what's going to happen here. And you can get some variants, with the jungle kingdoms and other things you can run into. But if I'm running Al-Qadim, you pretty much know what you're going to get. So when I start building a world, which, man, I haven't done in a long, long time, but I start small and I don't fill in the entire map all at once, as was touched on earlier, because I don't want the edges of that map filled in completely, because I don't know where things are going to go. So I'll have an idea for what kind of place it is. And that usually starts with a location. So a city or a kingdom, and I'll have a sketch of that, and there will be a flavor that it will hold. And then we just kind of go from there as a campaign unfolds.
And Wolfgang, you've created this world that now so many people play in. It's funny to hear how it started, because Midgard is huge now. And the Southlands are part of that. And you've got these crazy areas where these elder god mountain structures are. You know, it is an amazing place, and so evocative and so full of flavor. When your world gets to a point where it's so big that you've invited other people to come play in it, you know, I think this works even with a homebrew game, right? Like, I get to a point where my players are building the world, and they're saying, oh, I want to be from a town that's in this region, but you don't have one that's like this yet, so I'm going to draw up the town for you. Is that okay? You know? And of course I say, yeah, of course, please do my work for me, right? So what is that like once your sandbox expands and a lot of other people are playing in it? How do you kind of keep everything so it still feels like it's part of the world, so it still feels like it's part of Midgard?
It's a tough question, right? Every setting runs into this sort of sprawl and expansion at some point. The answer, I think, is just you have to have that core sense of, all right, these are the regions, this is the heart of the setting, this is the part we don't monkey with. And maybe you do have other regions in the world where people are more free to roam and go wild and wahoo. I mean, Midgard's approach to this cultural question that Dan raised, right, about moving from one setting to another on the same map, that kitchen sink sort of thing. Midgard's approach to that to say, yeah, we have multiple regions in the world, right? There's a Northlands region that's giants and Loki and Vikings like, and dwarves and Trollkin. There's a Dragon Empire, which is non-human dominated, dragons everywhere, scale folk, very focused on conquest and plunder, very different flavor. As long as the people who are coming into the setting know, okay, I'm doing something in this region, it needs to hit certain notes, you're set. Midgard has something called a World Bible, a World Book, which talks about what are the rules for the different regions, who are the major characters, what can you and can you not do with certain elements like ley line magic. And so that gets passed around a little to freelancers or designers who are playing in that sandbox. But ultimately, you want the world to grow and you want there to be surprises. Ed Greenwood told me this years ago at Gen Con. He's like, whenever people write something in the realms, I'm paraphrasing him terribly. Whenever people write something in the realms, I'm really happy because there's the chance that the world will surprise me, right? I mean, he knows the realms better than anyone. But someone else shows up and does something in Waterdeep and he wasn't thinking of that at all. But hey, how cool is that? Well, I mean, I've had the same experience since then. I didn't know exactly what he meant at the time because that was pre-Midgard, but now it's like, oh yeah, I never would have thought of that, but look at this cool thing you've done over here.
And if I can interject a point kind of related to what I said, Midgard is big enough and you have this sort of verisimilitude where you have almost continental regions. So when you go to the Southlands, it feels like you're going to a new continent. You know, the culture is so different when you're in the Southlands versus Zobek or even the Northlands or the Ruthenian Plains, right? All of those things are pretty real world geographically divided. So it feels right to have those cultural shifts.
Sure, and that makes sense, right? Canada is culturally different than Indonesia. So you should feel like that, and yet they're still all part of the same earth. And I think, you know, Midgard does that really, really well. And it sort of brings me to my other point. So let's say I'm in the middle of my 5e game. I pick up this Midgard book. I think, man, this is great. But, you know, we're playing in my homebrew world. How do you bring stuff in from Midgard? You know what I mean? How do I get my players to be in the Southlands suddenly because I've picked up the book and I love it, or I want the Dragon Empire to be part of the world that my ongoing game already has going on?
One of the original design rules back in the Zobek days was we're writing it for Zobek, we're writing it for this proto-Midgard, but we want it to be super portable. We want you to be able to pick up any adventure from Midgard and file off a couple of serial numbers and say, hey, it's a Realms adventure. Hey, it's in my homebrew. Some times we've done that better than other times. A few adventures have been very Midgard specific. But a lot of it, because it's high fantasy and it depends on certain tropes that are common to heroic fantasy, you're going to be able to move pretty quickly. The other thing we've done, of course, is to create some roads that lead to and from Midgard. We had this problem right away when we did the Southlands. It's like, well, we got people playing in northern Midgard. Do they really want to go on a big sea voyage, and travel, and do all this just to get to the Southlands? Maybe they do, because there's big treasure there, but let's make it easy. And so Midgard has shadow roads and portals that move you around from place to place. And the core city of the Southlands, Purbastet, has cat slide alleys because it's the city of cats. So you can walk down any street and walk out on a street that happens to be in the Southlands, which is, a little bit of Dungeon Master sleight of hand, right? Hey, you're in the Southlands because I want you to be there for this next adventure.
But that's what makes it great, right? I mean, that's one of the fascinating things. And again, it feels very Midgard because you have built in these great mechanics that make a great story too. Like that does feel ripped out of the pages of a fantasy novel. You walk down one street and because the moon was full, now you're halfway across the world.
As long as you're playing fair with your players and say, okay, guys, I realize I've kind of muscled you into this, but we're going to muster you right back out if you don't like it after the first adventure here or something, right?
Mm-hmm.
As long as they're not one way, you're trapped, and I've taken all your equipment kind of scenarios, right? The chances of player rebellion are pretty small. They'll say, okay, it's a side trip. Maybe it's cool. We get to loot some tombs, meet some cat folk, and then go home.
The old, I know you all wanted to be apprentice wizards, but guess what? You're all galley slaves. That's not cool.
No, I mean, if you start the campaign, everybody's a galley slave. Okay, you've got motive to stop.
One of my favorite ways to start a campaign, by the way.
I don't know. There's a long tradition in D&D of like, oh, the players are just screwed. You've got to rock, right? I mean, Dark Sun depends on that.
Man, did it.
And it's not the only instance, right? So it's doable, but I think Midgard sort of assumes that you're not a peasant or a galley slave or whatever. Right. It assumes that you're somewhat heroic to start.
Midgard is a land in need of heroes.
Yes.
Yeah. And for Dan and Steve, you guys are writing now in Midgard. Dan, you said, you came to it later on after the setting had been sort of well developed in Pathfinder. So as you guys are writing for it, what is some advice that you would give to somebody who is maybe creating adventures in a campaign setting like Midgard or the Forgotten Realms or, Freeport? Like if somebody has that book, and they say, I love this world, but I want to write my own adventures within this world. I want to come up with classes that would be within this world and that sort of thing. What sort of advice do you have for creating in someone else's world?
For me, I find that very, very easy. And in fact, it's kind of my go-to way to do. And Midgard is actually written in such a way, the current Midgard campaign setting, and I suspect heavily that the 5e version will follow suit, that it is just chock full of hooks, right? Nice. There'll be sidebars here and there that say, here's this city of this magocracy, Bemia. It's a city on an island, and it's highly magical, and there's all this crazy magical stuff going on. Here is a sidebar on this page that says, here's a funny thing that happens in this city with this group over here, and these 3 sorts of adventures could spawn from this. Have fun, do with it what you will. And that happens every couple of pages. Yeah. And actually, when I first talked to Wolfgang about writing setting material in Midgard, that was one of the things he stressed. Make sure there are plot hooks every, so often, because we want to really make this granular so people can latch onto it and do their own thing. So in Midgard, a lot of that work is done for you, right? Just read what you're seeing, find the things you like, and then just wherever your ideas grab, focus on that and run with it, right? In a setting that doesn't have those little nucleation points for you, they're still there. It's anything that you read in a setting, in any sort of material that is interesting, that makes you reread it a second time to see if there's anything you missed. Any of those things that catch your interest, That's where you start, and you just kind of let your ideas go from that point. And remember that when you're running your own game at home, you can do absolutely whatever you want with it, right? You can take it as inspiration. You can throw out an entire nation if it doesn't fit what you want to do for your game. Go nuts, all right? Do whatever you need to do and just let the material inspire you.
Yeah, I think I would agree 100% with everything Dan said and just amplify on it a little bit. A DM or a GM's enthusiasm is contagious, right? Mm-hmm. So when you're reading through something like Midgard and you find something that you just think, oh, that is so cool, that's the thing to latch onto, and then, put your enthusiasm to work and communicate that to the players. Create an adventure that capitalizes on that. And that's how you draw the players in. They see that you're excited about this. There's no bigger downer than sitting down to play an RPG and immediately getting the feeling that the GM would rather be somewhere else. Oh, yeah. that is an absolute, you're in for a bad afternoon.
Oh, yeah.
And I would also say, again, to amplify on what Dan said, just because something is written in the Midgard campaign book or any published book, don't be afraid to change it, right? It doesn't mean that just because the book says that, so-and-so is the mayor of this town, that doesn't mean you can't kill him in your adventure and replace him with someone else. That you can't have that town burn to the ground during a meteor shower or something.
Absolutely.
Just because it's in print doesn't mean that it can never change. Change and conflict is what makes these things exciting. So you've got to have big things happen to pull the players in and keep them excited.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think that is all very true. And I thank you for writing Midgard with lots of hooks, because that is invaluable as a dungeon master. I see those more and more now. People are putting into their campaign settings lots of hooks, or lots of, it could be this person is a vampire, or here are 5 different working theories on how the Mornlin was formed in Eberron, right? So it's awesome to have that as a dungeon master, to play off all of those great little hooks and adventures and let your mind wander. There's a ton of that, I feel like, in Tome of Beasts too, right? Every beast kind of has a different, well, here's a few ways you might center an adventure around this creature, or it might be the henchman of some other creature, or that kind of thing, which is always fun to have. Let's talk real quick about the products themselves. So we've got these 2 books. We've got a setting book. We've got a player book. Is this going to be one of those amazing, deep Kobold Press Kickstarters where you have lots of options? You can get just one book, you can get print, you can get PDF, all that goodness?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, it's absolutely set up with tiers for everybody, that you can get the whole giant package if you want to go deep. You can just cherry pick the pieces you want. If you're on the player side and you want the crunchy rules part and you're going to kit bash it into your homebrew anyway, go for that. If you're really deep into the setting, but you're playing it with Pathfinder or 13th Age or Fate or whatever, Savage Worlds, get the setting book and skip the crunchy rules part. We're going to split it up a lot of ways. We're also planning on doing a number of adventures as part of this Kickstarter, so that there's a whole, we've already done a bunch for 5th edition, but we're going to do more so that there's additional support there if you're not brewing up your own in the setting. James Hake has written a few.
Oh, yes. Amazing. Yeah. Love that guy.
He's doing great work, and a bunch of those are in the early stretch goals. So I think we're going to get some of his material.
Nice.
And I think we've got a couple from John Sawatsky, too, who wrote Prepared.
Yes.
That set of one-shots. So I think there's going to be a lot of juice, a lot of interesting things. We're working hard on cartography. We're going to include,
I can't wait to see that.
Yeah, we started it months and months ago because it's just the sort of work that takes a long time to bring up to the level you want it at.
And Anna Meyer's so good.
And Anna's so good. So we have the same cartographer, Anna Meyer, who did the Southlands poster map.
Oh,
and
beautiful.
So what will happen is ultimately you'll be able to put the Southlands map next to the new Midgard map, and they will match up in style. So they won't look like, the product of two different eras. the way you would now if you take the map from 5 years ago, which is also a terrific Midgard map, but looks very different. There's going to be sort of a buffet of options, whether you prefer digital, you prefer print, and whether you want the whole package or just a piece or two.
The big question is, right, this setting book, you said, if you're playing in 13th Age, if you're playing in Fate, you could still use this book. So the setting book is a lot of awesome information, right?
Yep.
That's a lot of your, I hate to call it fluff because it takes so long to write and is so dense and juicy. Why don't we call it the steak? That's the steak, right?
Yeah, I hate that word fluff.
So bad.
It's the fiction part. It's the
story, if you will.
The story. Sometimes it's just the characters and the hooks and the horrible, deadly locations. Right.
I love the stuff that is fluff. I hate the term because it gets used online so often as a derisive term. You know, it's like, we don't need that stuff. Where's my +1? Right? That's all I care about.
Also, if I may, if you're using that term derisively, you have never had marshmallow fluff because it is the most delicious part of a fluffernutter. Just sidebar.
Yeah, I mean, we put a lot of work into making this setting juicy, rich, spicy, piles of gunpowder everywhere, interesting characters, wars, disasters, plots and schemes. You know, people who don't value it and who are more into kick it down, grab the loot. I don't care whose money it is. They don't need that book. They don't want that book. They want the crunchy book full of options, right? Hey,
what's in the crunchy book? What kind of crunches we getting?
Well, I'm going to let Dan answer that one because he wrote a good chunk of it.
Right. So if you're familiar with the Heroes books, it's going to be a lot of those all bound into one volume. Rich Howard's Southlands Heroes, my Midgard and Unlikely Heroes. I'm right on that. Yes, Wolfgang?
Yes, you are.
Speaking out of turn. Oh, good. All right.
We're cutting out some of those Southlands races that are a little niche. Yeah. And a couple of the Unlikely Heroes are a little too unlikely to put in a core handbook like this. So we're being deliberate about what we're taking.
Okay, so we'll get kind of a core compilation of the things you really want and need to showcase the flavor and variety of Midgard, and then I believe in the Crunch book is that where some of these subclasses that have been
that's where the
going to end up. All right,
going.
I have the chapter list right in front of me if you want to hear it.
Ooh, let's hear some of the highlights.
Even better.
Yeah, this is just the chapter list now. There's a lot more going on. So, but it's new races, martial characters, divine characters, arcane characters, feats and backgrounds, new spell casting rules, new spells, new creatures. A lot of everything is what it amounts to.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's great that you are doing this, and of course along with that, right, is new magic, and that sort of ties into deep magic, which you guys have been putting out chapter by chapter for 5th edition, and it already exists for 13th Age and for Pathfinder. A great book it does for spells what Tome of Beasts did for monsters, essentially, right? It doubles your library. And Dan and Steve, I know you guys have a lot of work on that as well. So do some of these new spells also appear in the Midgard Player's Guide?
Well, I think the core magical schools that are basically that sprung full-formed in Midgard first are there from the very beginning. So that's things like clockwork magic, illumination, shadow magic, and ley lines are in there as well. So that's sort of a whole new subsystem and new spells. So those 3 things are absolutely in. And then there's a bunch more that it's sort of a question of how big is the spells section going to get, right? We could compile absolutely everything from deep magic into this book, but that's a couple hundred pages. So some of the flavors of deep magic are in the stretch goal category because they're not especially Midgard-ish, right? They're very cool, but they need not be linked in that setting book for the Hero's Handbook as currently envisioned. So we'll see.
Are you saying that if certain stretch goals are hit, there might be basically a whole 5th edition reprint of Deep Magic?
I might be saying that. Yeah.
All right. There you go.
It would be, I mean, that's adding a 3rd hardcover book. I'm not promising it out the gate, but like if a couple thousand people show up and say we're into it, then yeah, we will have the budget for it, right? And of course we do it. But if it's really the hardcore Midgard fans and nobody else, then maybe we'll save that for a separate project.
Well, and Dan and Steve, along the lines of these spells, because you guys have been putting out Deep Magic chapter by chapter, it's great fun. There are some really unique and clever spells here that smart players, if they get their hands on these things, are going to be able to just create a lot of mischief with, which I like. When you guys are designing spells, right, and whether it be for 5th edition or 13th Age or Pathfinder or whatever, there are so many factors. You know, when I sit down and I want to create a new race or a background or even a class, it's kind of easy to balance against something else. But when I sit down to make a new spell, it's like, oh, right, there are all of these factors. You know, there's things like concentration and casting times and components and the range of the spell, in addition to all of the numerical effects, like does it do damage? Does it have some other effect? Does it move an object? All of that kind of stuff. So let's say, like, if I sit down and I want to create a spell called Fire Tornadoes, what should I be thinking about when I am going to balance that spell?
Yeah, it starts with what it does, what level it is.
So you think that's the thing first is right. Obviously, if you have an idea for a spell, figure that out, and then figure out what level you want it to be and look at other spells in that area and balance it on that. Is that the way to go?
That's kind of my go-to. Steve, what do you think?
I was going to say it can be constructive to actually do it exactly the opposite way, which is figure out what you want the spell to do, work all of that out, and then figure out what level that spell is. Because if you wedge it into a level first, you can very easily find yourself going, oh, gee, there's just no way this spell can do all the things I want it to do, and have it be a 5th level spell, right? So you're almost better off figuring out what is the magic I want to work, and then where does that fit into the system.
Yeah, it can definitely go either way, and I've taken both approaches. But usually I'll start with an idea, and that will cleave pretty closely to a rough level range, if you know what I'm saying. Like if I have an idea that is essentially a different flavor of Fireball, I know it's going to hang out around 3rd level, maybe a little higher, because 3rd level is kind of deliberately a power spike, right? And Fireball in particular, that's sort of a paradigm shift. Once you hit that, the weenie horde paradigm of encounters doesn't really pose the same amount of threat as it used to, and that's by design. So you look at other spells that do things similar to what you're doing, and you try to, this is a big one for me, would I take this spell versus another spell already in the player's handbook that does the same thing, Sure. And that was actually, Steve and I have gone back and forth on a few of these that are such a cool idea or a fun flavor, but either they just end up being way too powerful, or it's like, well, why would I ever cast this when I could just cast Suggestion?
And so do you have an example of a spell you really love, maybe, that did make the final product?
The ones that jump to mind tend to be the ones that didn't make the cut. I mean, you mentioned players getting into mischief before. There have been a few that I have looked at, and my reaction was, wow. I mean, this is so cool. As a player, I could have so much fun with this, but the campaign would end 3 weeks later, because it's putting nuclear weapons into the hands of really irresponsible people.
Did you just call all players irresponsible?
I don't think I did, but that doesn't mean I wouldn't.
You have to design in mind that one problem player can ruin a spell for everyone.
Yes, exactly. You really have to watch out for what you allow people to get their hands on. And probably the trickiest thing in terms of balancing spells is trying to figure out what happens when you combine it with other things.
Yes.
You can look at a spell and say, all right, well, as a standalone thing, this spell is beautiful, right? It's not overpowered. It's just great. But then you remember, oh yeah, but there are wizards who can fly, right? That's just gonna blow this thing right.
What if this warlock has a rogue buddy?
Yes, exactly. What happens? If a wizard is casting this on himself, that's not a problem. But when he starts casting it on a fighter who already has AC 20.
I can give you an example out of Void Magic, actually, that the fighter is a perfect example of why it became tricky. So I wrote a spell called Nether Weapon, which is a little bit of a dark flavored necrotic void spin on the elemental weapon. And so I wrote it, and it was cool. And it, my idea is you cast this, and then you can hit someone with your stick or your dagger or whatever, and suck the life out of them. And it's neat and it's flavorful. But then I thought, well, as I have this written, I can cast that on my fighter pal who has 3 attacks. Okay, now I'm doing 24d6 damage with 1 spell. That's not every round. That's not okay. We need to revisit this.
Yeah, well, and it's funny to think about it in that level of detail. I think is important to think about it across the board and not just within the vacuum of how does this spell look on paper? How does it actually go? One of the things that I know Kobold Press does really well is playtesting. Every time you get a product from Kobold, that people have done extensive work bringing these things into their games and testing over and over again, which is a great thing. I've gotten to be part of that process before with Kobold, and it is super, super fun to see and super fun to sort of try to poke holes in the things that are there. When you guys are doing spells, whether it be for a product like this or if it's for something at home, do you then come up with a reason to use it in your next game so that you can make sure you're testing it out?
I think our usual process is generally, we have a playtest coordinator, right, who has teams of people for all the game systems we support, but lately it's been 5th edition. And when it was time to test monsters from Toma Beasts, we said, okay, we have, 50 groups and 400 monsters. Let's parcel them out. And it's generally better if we send them out to strangers because we will spackle over our own mistakes. Playtesting your own material is better than not playtesting at all, but you tend to sort of fill in and glide over and not catch your own errors.
Yep.
Whereas somebody else's errors just leap off the page, right? Look, how could he have thought this? This is totally broken.
Well, and we have it in our head. We know what we meant, right?
Yeah, so we know what we meant.
We'll use the thing for the thing we intended it when we wrote it, right?
Right.
Somebody
but the
else
point is to find somebody who doesn't use it as intended.
And let me tell you, the class playtest, the subclass playtest was extremely valuable in this regard. And it highlighted a few areas to me where I'm like, okay, I thought this was clearly worded. Obviously it isn't because everyone did it wrong.
It's feedback that's sort of annoying because I wrote it. It's obvious. Oh, no, actually it's not obvious.
Not obvious.
And it's so much better to get that question from 6 playtest groups than 600 fans later.
Right. Yes, as a blogger, I know this well. So
yeah.
But it does make you feel a little bit stupid when you're reading playtest feedback and something you thought was crystal clear was completely impenetrable to a whole lot of people.
Right.
Because your first reaction, of course, is why are they so stupid? When your reaction should be was why did I do it so wrong?
Yeah.
I usually wind up on the side of gratitude that, hey, we caught this early instead of late.
Yeah.
Because, no book goes to print perfect, but you want it as tight as it can be. And the bigger it is, the more opportunities there are to get something somewhere that's going to trip people up.
Slip through the cracks.
Of course. And and as Dan, I know you can attest to this. As a frequenter of the D&D Facebook groups, it seems that people can interpret rules every which way, including adding text that is not there or ignoring text that is there. So it's always good to playtest your stuff, and I do find that Kobold has some really high-quality playtested stuff. So I really, really appreciate you, like you said, hiring extra hands and making sure that people can get something that goes to press with some really, really quality game material in it. I love that.
And let me just say, bless Ben McFarland for wrangling all of that.
Goodness, yes. I don't know how he keeps it all straight, but he does.
He does, and it's great.
Totally. Well, gentlemen, we are at the end of our time here, but before we go, real quick, let's mention the Kickstarter one more time. It is the Kickstarter for the Midgard Campaign Setting and player book. Look for it probably, we're thinking around end of January, beginning of February.
It might be a week or two before then, actually. We'll see.
Excellent, excellent.
Trying to pull it together by the middle of the month, but good intentions, etc. So we'll see. But by the end of January.
That's great. That's great. Well, I would love to have the three of you back on to keep talking about world building and spell design and Midgard. That would be amazing if you are all down for that. And maybe we can have you back on when the Kickstarter is ongoing and talk about that as well.
Sure.
Hey, any excuse to get me back on here, man. Anytime.
Any excuse to have you on, Dan, is great. So want to make sure you're still connected with reality after being a moderator for the 5th edition D&D.
I've hit a strange equilibrium these days. I'm pretty cool.
Only you could be so calm about all this. So it's great. It's great to have all of you on. Before we go, Wolfgang Baur, where can people find you?
You can find me at koboldpress.com. You can find me on Twitter as Monkey King, and I float around Facebook now and again.
And Dan Dillon, where can people find you?
I'm also on Twitter at Dan_Dillon_1, super creative. And I am, as previously mentioned, I moderate the Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition Facebook discussion group. It's about 55,000 members, and we love new people. So come in and ask questions and join the discussion.
And Steve Winter, where can people find you?
I'm also on Twitter at STVWinter. I believe I have a new series of Howling Tower articles about to start up at Kobold Press sometime in the next week or so.
Excellent.
So people can find me there too.
Yeah, can't wait to read those. Those are always so much fun. So thank you for writing those. Gentlemen, thank you so much for joining me on Tabletop Babble.
Thanks for having us.
Oh, it was my pleasure, man. Glad to be here.
Thanks, Jake.
Those dudes really know their stuff. Huge thanks to Wolfgang, Dan, and Steve for being on Tabletop Babble. This podcast is still new, and the best way to help it grow and to help others find it is to leave us a 5-star review on iTunes, Stitcher, or whatever pod-catching platform you're using is. To encourage you to do that, I'm reading one new 5-star review verbatim each episode and crediting the person who left it. Make me say anything you want. Today's 5-star review comes from iTunes from Aaron Fish. It is entitled, Great Interview, Keep It Coming. Aaron Fish says, as a recent player/DM of 5e, resurrected from 2e, I enjoyed this podcast. I enjoyed the inside look from hearing from Mike, and it gave me perspective on the current state of affairs, and it helped me articulate why I am recently drawn back into the RPG world. Thank you so much for this amazing review, Aaron. It really means a lot to me that you would take time out of your day to do this. People, make me say anything you want, and if you haven't listened to our first episode with Mike Merles, go back and check it out. It is a really, really good interview, and Aaron references it here in his review. Tabletop Babble is a show on the Don't Split the Podcast Network. Special thanks to Rudy Basso for founding it with me. Our theme music, which you're listening to right now, was provided by Battle Bards. Until next time, remember that RPGs are like sex. If everyone's having fun, you're doing it right.